All right, guys, I'm back. How you doing? Alexis here with Quiet Girl Gang on my next episode of Alexis Attacks. This is one of those kind of episodes where if you didn't watch the other one or the preceding one, go back and watch because we're kind of like in a little like mini series. I'm talking about my journey of really understanding the drift of my car and the performance of my car, and how I've started to be able to specifically troubleshoot it, which I think is like one of the best things that we can ever teach one another to grow the community, how to understand what's going on with their cars better to improve their performance. Super short recap. On the last episode, I really just focused on the first two things that started to get me understanding how to troubleshoot my car when something's going wrong. One, I had to figure out and understand like the basic, like the physics and mechanics of drifting, which is in essence the concept of sliding friction, and further the concept of the coefficient of friction, which is kind of that continuous and instantaneous balance between power and friction, so that the car actually does kind of produce that gliding or sliding motion. Understanding that if there's an imbalance between power or friction in either way, it's going to mess up your drift. And then the second thing that I had to kind of figure out is if knowing the drift is created by that good balance between power and friction, I had to figure out which parts of the car contribute to providing power and which parts of the car contribute to providing friction. So then when things started going wrong, if I could figure out if I was having more of a power versus a friction problem, it would kind of start guiding me on where to look to fix the problem. So that was the second thing. Now, what I want to talk about today is my journey in analyzing and kind of breaking down my drift. Meaning when I'm driving and something goes wrong, how have I been going about trying to figure out what's wrong so that I can fix it? And again, I said the same kind of like little disclaimer on the last episode, which is this is my experience. So this may not be exactly how other people go about thinking about it. It is not the end all be all, the only way to go about thinking about how to troubleshoot your drift. This is like how I've learned, and this whole journey, this whole like Alexis Attacks like larger series has all been about my journey as a novice driver without a lot of driving experience getting into RC drifting. So again, this is my experience. I hope it helps somebody, but it is not the end all be all. I'm not claiming to say that this is the right way to go about troubleshooting your drift. It's just what I know. So after understanding how drifting goes, understanding and learning the parts of the car that contribute to power and friction, now I'm going to talk about how I analyze my drift. It's really three basic things that I do. One, I identify the problem. I'm just going to get right into it. I identify the problem, and I'm very specific either to myself or when I'm asking somebody for help. I'm very specific as to what my problem is. And when I say that I'm specific, I'm not trying to use too much like lingo that I don't know. I don't use words that I don't understand. And a lot of people, I think, in all like conversation, when they try to talk about a problem, they talk about it backwards in terms of like a diagnosis or a solution. So instead of like identifying the problem and being specific and saying, you know, I don't know, there's something wrong with my camber. You know, there's something wrong with my rear camber. That's actually like already like identifying like more specifically where the problem is. It's almost leaning more, excuse me. It's almost leaning more into the like diagnosis part. Sorry, that's my PT brain coming back. Of the problem, and not necessarily saying exactly just what the problem is. So the things that I talk about, and I got my notes here, so the things that I talk about when I'm trying to identify the problem and be specific, what side of the car it's happening on, so left or right, or both, you know, what half of the car the problem's happening on. So is it happening, or am I seeing it happen in the front, or am I seeing it happen in the rear? What direction the car's going in when I see the problem. So is it when I'm trying to like drift or turn right versus turn left? Is it, so like what direction? What part of the drift? So if I'm noticing that the problem is happening in my drift, is it happening in initiation? Is it happening in the middle? Is it happening towards the end when I'm trying to straighten back out? The part of the track might be, getting more specific in identifying the problem. Is your problem happening during a straight? Is it happening during like a tighter hairpin? Is it happening during like a larger sweeper? At least those are the three like major parts, of a track that I've been able to identify. And then the other part is a basic symmetry check. So looking at the car from like front to back, right to left, as looking at as many things that you can spot on your car. Does everything look symmetrical? Like, is your toe out symmetrical, or is one like tire like this? Like, is your camber like symmetrical, or is one like going all wonky? Looking at like all your like connecting links, looking at like your connections and things like that. Does everything look, for the most part, symmetrical? So if something doesn't look symmetrical, that would be a detail that you could identify as part of the problem. And again, as much information and being as specific as you want or specific as you can is really either going to help yourself figure out what the problem is, or it helps me figure out what the problem is, or it's going to help somebody that you're asking for help from. It's going to help them understand what the problem is and be able to help you a little bit more effectively. Nobody wants, and I think I said this when I talked about the episodes about like the do's and don'ts for like newbies versus experienced drivers. Nobody wants to help you when you just give your car to them and just says like, it's not drifting. It doesn't work. That is no help to nobody. And I'd be hard pressed to find somebody who's going to be very excited or at least like invested in helping you if you just kind of like helplessly throw your car at them and just say like, it just doesn't work. If you come to them with some type of information to give them some type of direction to go into, you'll definitely increase your likelihood of getting support from the community to help you figure out what's going on with your car. So first thing in analyzing the drift, identifying the problem and being specific. I'm trying to think of an example of something I'm working on right now. Big sweep. In a big sweep, instead of being able to follow like the arc of the sweep towards the end of my sweep, so like, or towards the end of at the end of the sweep or the end of my drift, like initiation and mid goes okay, but then towards the end, I kind of start doing this like wide coming around type thing. And it takes me a while to kind of like pull the car back into like the path that I need. So that's just an example. I figured out what the problem was and how to fix it. But that's an example of kind of identifying the problem and being specific. You're describing what the problem is, not necessarily providing like the parts or the solutions or anything like that, but you're just getting very specific as what's going wrong that you're seeing and what you want it to be able to do. And that's enough. Second thing that I do with analyzing the drift is asking myself, to me, does it look like more of a sliding drift problem, or does it look like more of a steering problem? And again, this is my experience. So the top two things that I've kind of been able to narrow it down to is that at least like if the problem is happening in like a drift pattern, so whether it's like a hairpin or like a larger sweep, it tends to be more of a sliding drift rear of the car issue if the drift is incomplete. Meaning either you start drifting and you spin out, or you stop drifting and at some point you just kind of stop before you're supposed to be done with like the entire like path of the track. So if there's an incomplete drift, I have found usually the solution is found in more the rear of the car that has to do with the sliding friction and like the drifting part. The balance in that power versus friction, that coefficient of friction got lost. We lost the balance, so then the drift stopped. The flip side of that is if you're able to drift, or for me again, if I find that I'm able to drift, but it's very uncontrolled, like I'm having to like do something funky with the steering, or I can't keep like a consistent throttle for some reason or something like that, then I kind of look a little bit more at steering, because at least for like the initial attempt to fix the problem, that coefficient of friction, that balance between power and friction was maintained because I was able to get through the drift it just was kind of wonky. A lot of times, like the car will like, it'll wiggle. It kind of has this like weird fishtaily type thing. So in those cases, I tend to look a little bit more towards, steering. I tend to look a little bit more towards steering. Again, my experience, what I have found that helps and that works, this may not be like the end-all be-all or the only way to identify whether something is a sliding or steering problem. But it's basic and it's been working for me as a newbie driver. And then the last thing that I look at in analyzing the drift is if within understanding that it's a sliding or figuring out if it's a sliding or a steering problem, next step is, does it look more like a power or a friction problem within the sliding issue or within the steering issue? So again, I'm looking at those parts of the car for the most part that have to do with delivery and modulation of power. So like the battery, the motor, the ESC. We talked about how like I view the suspension as kind of like a power. I put it in the power column. Your diff and your axle. In terms of steering, then we're talking about like servo and gyro. Those kind of like deliver or modulate the power of the steering to help guide the car. Again, at least from my understanding. And I will say, I do plan to dive a little bit deeper into understanding how like the servo and the gyro works. So I might have that a little bit off, but for what I can kind of see and from what I've learned so far, I would put it a little bit more on like a power category as it pertains to controlling steering. Friction, again, your camber, your toe, your tire compound, your wheel traction or like the wheel stiffness, your weight distribution between front and rear, your center of gravity, roll center type stuff. So again, to sum it up, after I understood drift mechanics, this is what we talked about last episode, we understood drift mechanics, we understood the power and the friction components, and now I'm going into analyzing my drift. I figure out what the problem is, just plain Jane, what's wrong. I try to figure out if it's a sliding or a steering problem. So if the drift isn't complete, I'm going to look more at like a drifting sliding problem. If the drift is complete or I'm able to drift it, but it's just not controlled, I'm going to look at steering first. And then within those two columns, sliding versus steering, I'm going to look for, do I feel like there's a problem with power, how the power is delivered or modulated, or how friction is being maintained. So there you go. That's my next step in troubleshooting my drift, how I analyze. Next episode, and what I'm going to cover next, is how I fix, how I go about starting to fix. And that's going to be a fun one because I think about it in a lot of different ways. So again, thanks. All your feedback is great and appreciated. Like, share, comment, totally subscribe to the channel. I'll catch you in a couple of days with the last, maybe next to last. We might have 2 more episodes. We might have two more times to talk about troubleshooting your drift for best performance, especially for us newer drivers. All right, guys, hang in there.